Che ore sono?
Pericoloso, si fa girare le scatole.
In effetti.
Beh, aspettiamo qualche altro minuto.
Let's just wait another few minutes.
Va bene, allora, grazie.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming back to join us this afternoon. I hope everybody had a nice lunch. So we'll start again dealing with the issue of fare-free public transport. Both dealing with the issue of how towns should be planned or replanned in order to make public transport more convenient and work better. And on that topic, we have Mr. Lucio Zazzera here with us, who is a lecturer in urban planning in Pescara. And then we're going to be dealing with the topic of how regional administrations can, from a budget point of view, a resource management point of view, manage their transport. So how a local area can tackle that kind of issue. For that, we have Mario Mazzocca from the Abruzzo region, who is going to be talking to us about how we can deal with these things at local government level. Then Fabrizio Lucas is going to be talking to us about urban planning, but not from a technical point of view or a planning point of view, programming point of view, but rather from a lawyer's point of view, a legal aspect. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Juricin, who's going to perhaps be speaking from a bit of a different point of view here on this panel, and he's going to be talking to us about the problems that are connected to this. And we'll finish off with Dr. Paolo Vergnano, who, in addition to being a local MP for the Five Star Movement, he is also one of the main proponents for fare-free public transport in Italy, and is very much involved in the topic and goes around Italy talking to people about the issue. So he'll be talking to us a little bit about what's going on and the ideas that he's putting forward. So I won't take any longer in my introduction. Instead, I'll pass the floor straight over to Professor Zazzera. Thank you very much, Daniela Aiuto, for inviting me here today. Hello, everybody, and I'd like to thank everybody who spoke this morning, because I think that this morning's panel was very interesting. We heard a lot from lots of different people, from lots of different points of view, and we had a lot of very interesting information. It's very important, of course, that we do discuss these issues. So, my speech today, and of course it may come out a little bit different at the end of it from what I've planned, because a lot of things have already been mentioned this morning, and I don't want to go over things that other people mentioned this morning. But I'd like to start by talking to you about something that we heard a lot this morning. Particularly, we hear this when we're taking a more technical approach to this issue. I work at a university. I also work in urban planning. And that means that I often can approach these topics from above. By that I mean looking at a more kind of regional approach. So in this specific case, when we're talking about the future of local public transport becoming free, I think that on this issue particularly, this is something which can't be dealt with on a purely technical way, particularly when we're looking at a cost-benefit analysis. Public transport is a system which has a huge social value connected to it for all of us. And with the changing world that we live in, and the significant changes that we're seeing in today's world, which often are beyond our understanding and beyond the understanding of our people in local government, this is something which has to be looked at quite specifically. So on my slides today, I've removed a lot of the statistics. I just want to kind of talk to you directly really today, but this is a page from the latest One Habitat report, where it makes a few comments on the fact that since the 1950s, the urban population has become the main proportion of our world's population. The number of people living in cities is greater than the number of people not living in cities. But it's important for us to also understand what our cities are becoming, what kinds of cities we're going to have. Major conurbations are continuing to increase in size. And for the most part, our cities are not major, enormous cities. Instead, they're medium-sized cities. That's what we've got for the most part. And so, in order to understand this concept better, it's important for us to consider the fact that for a very long time, so from the end of the war to, say, 10 years ago, the changes in this area followed changes in in infrastructure. But let's go step by step on this. The second image, if I can have it, thank you, shows you what has happened over quite a short period of time. So this is just looking at less than 20 years. And in that time, the urban population has exploded in some places. In Europe, however, it's remained relatively stable, as it has in North America, but in a lot of other areas, it has significantly increased. So what's happened? Well, the conditions for access to basic services for the population have changed, and the living conditions for people in the countryside has changed a lot, as have the living conditions in developing countries. A lot of people have moved to cities in these countries because they don't have a lot of opportunities outside the cities. A lot of people also have come to Europe because they're fleeing from one thing or another. So that's part of the point that has to be taken into account. But the populations are still moving to cities, and why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that because they're the most attractive areas of a country, and by that I mean that for the most part they offer, they have a very high population, a very dense population. And this density of the population is a way of improving the choices that people have access to. It makes it easier for them to find a job or to create a job. And this is true now as much as it was in previous centuries. Of course, now the opportunities we have open to us are more sophisticated. Cities are more sophisticated, there's more innovation there. Cities are the center of production, but they're also the center of society and culture. Nowadays, cities represent the concentration of all of those values. And that means that their competitiveness also increases. Cities need to be competitive, of course. And this morning, our colleague from Vilnius was speaking to us about the different dynamics that play a role for the population. And we also heard about the effect that this has had on the economy and on culture. And we discussed this as well, of course, in the Q&A session. And this is something which is really very important, because the more innovative a city is, the more cultural a city is, the more productive a city is in those terms, the more people are attracted to it, the more dense the population will be. And the more effective and efficient this city can be. All of this makes these cities more attractive. And so, as you can imagine, this is a process which will continue and will probably become stronger. Today, 3.9 billion people live in cities that are relatively small, below 1 million inhabitants. And these 3.9 billion people represent more than half of the 7.5 billion living in the world. And we imagine that the global population is going to increase to 9 billion, so you can imagine that the increase in people living in cities will also be quite considerable. We're looking now at critical levels. So what has this got to do with the issue of transport? Well, in these cities, in these urban areas, the mass movement of people is absolutely vital. It's one of the elements that has a really important role to play. And the speed of data transfer is also very important. And it has to be said that it's that speed of data and speed of data transfer is not the same everywhere in the world. In towns, there is more innovation. Things move quicker. And so this kind of communication, this speed of data transfer is also something which attracts people to cities. Now, we know that we can speak to whoever we like, wherever we like, whenever we like. But if you're not in a city, it's difficult to meet people, and that's something that we need. And so cities are providing new reasons, new ways to attract people. Ways that are different to what attracted people to cities in the past, but nonetheless very important. And nowadays we're seeing a real major change. This means that urban management has to meet new challenges that didn't even exist a few years ago. 20 years ago, some of these issues we were talking about were pipe dreams, but today, sustainability and supporting the changes that are happening in cities, saving energy, producing energy, reducing pollution, or even getting rid of pollution completely, and providing safer environments for people. These are things that are incredibly important. It's not just researchers and specialists that are dealing with these issues, but also local governments that are having to deal with this now, politicians that are having to deal with this now. They also have to be able to tackle this kind of issue. And so we can see that something is starting to change. Change in the soul of what we call a city. And this is very closely linked, quite obviously, to technological developments and cultural developments. Personally, I think that we can summarize the challenges that cities are facing at the moment can be summarized in just a few words. So density. Density is particularly important. Density is also a term which may be a little bit difficult to understand in this context. Why is it so important? Well, it's important because it's a way of making our cities work better, of making them more profitable, of using the funds they have better, and of improving services. Here, of course, we're talking about public transport. If we have the opportunity to provide better services, we want to ensure, of course, that we can make all of these services more economic. So these are the kind of things that are very important, and we have to achieve this. We have to meet these challenges by changing the way that we look at cities. Now, if we think about 200, 300 years ago, we were looking at very small cities. And if you look at London between the two wars, London encountered enormous problems. It had to have the 1943 plan, which was to start building in the Greenbelt around London. So for them at that time, density was a problem, and density can be a problem. It was a problem for suburbs, and then of course there's all sorts of infrastructure that comes with that, roads and lots of other issues. And so there was this really big step towards moving into urban areas. And actually today we're facing a similar problem. A lot of towns have grown either following that kind of model or with a kind of urban disorder which has a similar effect, but which at the end of the day is worse because it's not as manageable. Now, another term that's very important, and this is something we've mentioned before, it's speed. Everything has to be offered at great speed nowadays. Whether it be service provision or physical movement of the people who live in towns. This has to be provided within big towns, between big towns. That's also very important. And we have to provide high speed within cities as well, between different areas. And this is something which is connected to public transport, because speed with a private vehicle is not necessarily that what's being taken into account. If somebody chooses to have a private vehicle, use a private vehicle, it doesn't necessarily mean that what they think is important is speed. In Italy, for the most part, it is private vehicles that are used for getting people around. It's road transport that we use for transporting goods, and we've got the slowest goods transport in Europe, and that's very important as well, because that involves a higher cost for transport. And a higher cost for transport obviously means that the economy of a society becomes poorer, and that's not something that we can stand by and watch. However, well-organised transport means also a less polluted city. It means a healthier city. It means a safer city. I was very interested to hear what our colleague from Naples was saying. And I'd like to add to what you said by saying that a lot of road accidents that happen in towns. A lot of people think that it happens outside towns on motorways, but that's not the case. They happen in urban zones for the most part, and that's not something that we can have. That's not the way cities can work. So what are we talking about here? Well, these are the aspects that we have to be looking at, particularly in Italy, particularly if you're from the centre or the south of Italy. No, it's not necessarily that the north is doing incredibly well, but it's better in any case. The percentage usage of public transport in the north is much higher than it is for the smaller cities in the central and southern area of Italy. If you look at the percentage figures for Vilnius and the Tallinn, the public transport figures there, they're really very important. You were telling us you were looking at around 50% for the incidence rate there, as compared to private vehicles. Well, in the centre and south, we're around 15%, 20%. So it's less than half of what you've got. I mean, a lot less than half. But of course, we also do have some quite considerable problems with public transport. A lot of people know that, but that's obviously a different issue. Still a political issue, but a different one. And then there's another term which I think is also very important and becoming more important nowadays within our urban areas, and that is equality. What does equality mean in our cities? Well, this is something, I mean, it is of interest for a city when it's trying to attract people to it, when people are looking at it. It's important that these cities have got systems which are capable of providing services in a balanced way to the entire population. And I mean all kinds of services by this. This means that they have to have public transport services that are capable of carrying out a balanced, equal service across the board. And there are other discussions that stem from this. Something that is particularly important is having a balanced, equal access to these services. And this inclusion is very important, ensuring that everybody can take part, ensuring that all citizens living in that city feel heard, giving everybody the opportunity to take part. What cities should do, and this relates to urban safety as well, is provide a more balanced, safer service. Often this leads to a kind of contradiction. People sometimes say that in the beautiful suburbs of Paris, there are problems with juvenile delinquents or terrorist threats. Well, honestly, I have to say we can't forget the rhetoric and the propaganda that we have heard. But the life outside a city can be very different. There are situations outside cities where this kind of ostracism from the city has been created. And that's something that has to be avoided. How can you avoid it? Well, you can avoid it by creating a mobility system which is fast, which also ensures that everybody who wants to can move into a town quickly and can feel that they belong to that town or city. So there are categories here, things that we have to think about that 20 years ago we didn't need to think about at all. There are new things happening, things people didn't expect. Things which are very concerning and have to be dealt with very quickly. Traffic that we're seeing at the moment, not only is it finding itself in crisis because of the way cities work at the moment, but this kind of private vehicle transport is getting itself in this mess. It was interesting to hear what's been said, or the discussions that have been had in the Netherlands and in Sweden, although I understand that no specific procedures have been agreed upon. But they, a few years ago, said, we don't want to have private cars in cities anymore, or we don't want to have certain cars coming into our cities any longer. At Dieselgate that we had, where the car manufacturers were found with their hands in the cookie jar. This really is showing that we're reaching the technical limits in terms of reducing emissions. That's what it means. They didn't just all go mad. Smart diesel is not something that we're seeing anymore or hearing talk of anymore. Because it's simply too expensive to produce. And what all of this means is that there's a sign, there's a direction that we're moving in, and it's a one-way street. This kind of transport, with using engines that consume fossil fuels, that is something which we just can't do anymore. Not because we're very green or because we're better than other people or because we're vegans or we think positively. That's not why. But because we can no longer accept it. We can no longer accept that this 70% of fossil fuel emissions that the world is seeing at the moment that comes from cities that take up only 7% of the world's surface area. So 70% is coming from just this 7% of surface area. If we don't do something about that, that 70% is going to become completely unsustainable. It will be something that we can absolutely no longer deal with. We just won't be able to breathe in our cities any longer. So what will happen? Well, I think we'll move on to hybrids, then we'll move on to electric vehicles. But essentially, I think it will lead eventually to the decline of private vehicles. And that's something that we can already start to think about, start taking into account when we look at cities. Why not? And there's something else. You all know that there's been a lot of development in self-driving cars, self-driving vehicles. Everybody that's working on that, they're all aware that this kind of technology will move towards more kind of car sharing and automated taxis, which will enable everybody to have a vehicle outside their house which can drive itself. I mean, it is a possible vision of the future. But as an urban planner, let me tell you something. We who no longer want to keep expanding our cities, who want cleaner cities, what can we do to change our composite view of our urban spaces? Well, we need to start designing them differently, so that in the future, in 30 or 50 years, we don't find ourselves having to scrap everything and build it again. We're not Japanese, we're not Americans, we don't want to just tarmac it and build on top. We're Europeans. We're conservatives. We need space. And the future of our cities is going to be planned on the basis of the replanning of these areas. Today we've got 20 meters squared of road per citizen, which cost exorbitant amounts for local governments. You don't just have to build them, you have to clean them, you have to maintain them. And so we've got this 20 square meters that relate to system, to replanning, to balance sustainable development for urban areas. So we've got these 20, but 10 meters squared of that is already needed for the traffic that we've got at the moment. And we have to bear in mind, of course, that we're using roads just to park our cars as well. And that's the kind of thing that we can't be doing any longer. We need that space to do something else with it. And I think this is the kind of thing that we have to take into account when we're doing our planning for tomorrow. I'll leave it there because I think I've already probably taken a little bit too much time. Hopefully I've provided some ideas. At the university, this is the kind of thing that we're working on, and we, in some cases, are also managing to get some quite good relationships going with local governments and collaborate with them. Here, however, we often find ourselves having discussions saying that Europe needs to get together, Europe needs to wake up to what's happening. We can't do this separately. Here, instead, we need to have a different way of thinking. We need to favour research. We need to develop new models, be more innovative and more sustainable. We need to make the cities that we've got more sustainable. Because we can't just sit at home reading through magazines thinking, oh, how lovely, there's a little place in Austria that's producing all of the energy it needs. That's not what we should be doing. We can't get all excited because there's an experiment going on in Brazil. Instead, we need to do this work ourselves. We need to work to change the cities that we've got. I'll leave it there. If you've got any questions after, I'll be happy to answer them.
Grazie, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Zazzara. It's very interesting what you just said. Now I give the floor to architect Mario Mazzocca. Thank you very much, and thank you also for inviting me here and giving me the possibility to give you my opinion. It's been a very interesting day so far. And I think that we're moving outside the normal framework to a certain extent. And what I'd like to do is look at sustainability, integrated actions, etc. And one part of the topic I think that I'm going to talk about is part and parcel of the title of this meeting, public transport. And coming back to what Dr. Kablowski said, fare-free public transport. So let's bring this back into the discussion again. And I feel that what is very important here is sustainability. I think from square one, we've noted that this is something which is extremely important also for Professor Zazzara, who has just given us such a fabulous intervention. I think we're talking about this at a time when we are looking more and more at the different components of sustainability, not just economic or environmental, but we're also focusing on social sustainability, on our citizens that live in our countries. We've been looking at the future of our regions. And I come, for example, from a mountainous region, which is part and parcel of the Apennine mountain chain. And the ecology is very important there, so we have to meet certain requirements. So what I'm going to try and do in my contribution today is underscore certain details which relate to the general topic of sustainability. And look into a strategy which we are making progress on under COP21, and that is, of course, climate change and the plans that we have to deal with it. Of course, there is no master plan, but we have to look at how we're going to be able to survive in the medium and long term in this context. And we're moving forward to a process where many are participating, and a process which is spread throughout our region. I've noted from what others said that we're faced with many different choices in our regions. And some have given priority to certain issues, for example, health. But I think that the main topic we've been looking into detail on relate to the impact of climate change on our area. And I think that what's been happening in terms of climate change is leading us in a way to think more about survival of our cities, as Professor Zadzara was saying. For example, in Miami, we've seen huge investment to try and keep the floods away, infrastructure which has to be built. Now, given so many premises, I should like to focus on some local projects, some local experiments which we have been carrying out. One already done and one which is in progress. What we're doing is bringing to an end a feasibility study which we have conducted together with Pescara University, which is very important technically and scientifically and strategically. I shall be talking about that, and I shall also spend a few minutes. I don't have too many slides, by the way, as you'll see, because I know that I've got to keep to time. Mr. Zadzara referred to a very important issue, change. We're convinced that the only way that we can do this, and we've seen this from the 20th century up until today, that what we're faced with are towns and cities which are not properly adjusted to the way in which we want to live. So we've had this summed up by others, and also in COP21 in Paris. I don't want to dwell on the definite effects that this political decision has had or will have, but I think that we as the European Union now do have a specific directive which should have an important impact on how we develop alternative energy. So we have carried out a project in cooperation, as I said. You've seen part of it there on the slide that I've got there. We've carried it out with the Ministry of Economics and our Public Transport Authority and various other companies involved in the sector. And this study relates to hydrogen mobility in Italy. It's something which, in fact, is being carried out nationwide. There's a national plan for progressive replacement of our public transport fleet with vehicles which run on hydrogen methane. So it's progressive. We've started off as an initial experiment, and there's going to be, slowly but surely, a replacement of our vehicles. The first stage is 7 to 9 months. There's an area in the Pescara region where the city is linking up with other parts of the region and working on replacement, change of the current fleet of public transport vehicles. Of course, there are a lot of independent variables that we have to bear in mind. As Professor Sadra said, it's very important to look at population density and its impact on certain parts of our countries. So what we're carrying out at the moment, what's in progress, is a project which has different elements to it. Also in Lombardy and Liguria, there's a project on the Brenner motorway. Which is coming up with interesting results to make sure that this is a sustainable highway. Anyway, the project which we have been carrying out under COP21 is linked to another Italian project We have this specific measure under COP, 100 projects for the climate. And this is involving lots of small areas. In some instances, these are just experiments. But all these are part and parcel of a larger and broader approach which can be used by the local authorities. So we've got a national approach. We have commitments to wind projects, for example. We've been looking at geographical and microclimate issues. And in this case, what we have is something which is focused much more on our urban areas. We've carried out an activity which probably in the end will not be too different to what Professor Sazara was talking about. But of course, always the base conditions are different. Now, this project is a project which is still in the course of a pre-feasibility study, and it concerned an issue which we also presented at in Paris. It's a topic which is related to combating pollution. Because we think if we use the current national standards which are in force, they're not adequate. So what we've done is develop different strategies which go beyond them. And this pre-feasibility study concerns a major part of the coast of Abruzzo in the Montesilvano and Pescara province. We've discussed at length the problems also of the salt pans, the salt marshes, and on the possibility of developing a strategy which can use the productivity which we get from using renewable sources and which can go beyond that. And we've been looking at how we can tackle pollution, how we can reclaim areas of land in our cities. For example, rivers, which have been very important, not just for nature, but also in our urban areas. I think that we really need to look at our rivers throughout our country, not just have proper governance of our river areas, but go further. also, another thing which is important when we're looking at urban areas, such as Pescara or Montesilvano in Abruzzo, which is physically linked to Pescara, we need to look at the issue of sustainable mobility. We've been working together with the university on slow mobility. And we want to come up with a common commitment to car sharing and carpooling. So what we've done is draft a paper showing how we can use plans for producing energy broadly sustainable energy. So wind energy, micro systems, solar panels, and how we can work towards reclaiming the green lungs of our urban areas. Of which, of course, the Pescara area is the most important. We've heard already about sustainable mobility today. We're always hearing about how we can implement it, what we can do. And this brings me back to the issue of population density. I think if you analyze the issue really, apart from certain problems, which are relevant, I think the main point is that we need to be more flexible in our political strategies and come up with projects which are going to be essential in the future. Also, for equity, for fairness. If I think of the Apennines in Italy, on the one hand, there's a fantastic diversity. There are so many microenvironments. And I think that these have to be taken account of in any type of development plans which institutions come up with. Thank you very much.
Grazie, architetto Mazzocca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mazzocca. I'll now pass the floor to Fabrizio Lucas, our lawyer for today, to see the other side of the debate. We've talked about the future, we've had a couple of hypotheses, talking about public funds and what can be provided. We've heard about competitiveness in terms of emissions. Of course, Europe is moving forward a lot when it comes to hydrogen-powered vehicles and electric vehicles as well. That much we've heard. We also understood that cities need to be replanned and certain spaces are going to be converted. So now let's hear from Mr. Lucas. Thank you very much to you for giving me the floor and for having invited me to be here with all of you today to speak to you about this. Legally speaking, only God is above the European Parliament, so it's absolutely an honour to be here with all of you. What I'm going to say today is going to be an introduction to the conclusion of today's seminar. I'm not going to try to find the solution myself, but instead what I'm going to do is try to show you issues that we're encountering with the approach and issues with the problem in terms of business management and political management as well, looking at the social efficacy of certain measures and the various levels of governance. Because depending on the level of governance, depending on the objectives and the kind of business management, things change. I'm not going to focus a lot on the urban planning points because the two gentlemen who've spoken before me covered that in quite a lot of detail. I'm a lawyer by training, dealing with urban planning. And since 2009 in my region, I've been looking at urban planning. My work often doesn't relate specifically to this. However, it does talk about the liberalisation of services, and this is something which is particularly important in Italy, bearing in mind the situation that we find ourselves in. A lot of fears are linked to this because people think that providing simplification in these areas is going to increase problems in terms of land use and other factors. Now, I've worked at the Regional Agency for Development as well as at other bodies that deal specifically with these issues. So I've got a personal idea of how the management of services of general interest actually works. I've never done it myself, of course. So, here on this first slide, this is a rendering of a mathematical model just to show you how complex the transport system can be in terms of organising it, planning it, and trying to make improvements to an existing network. In technical terms, you've got nodes and modal and intermodal exchanges. So at a programming level and a political level, this is all very complex. And getting balance is quite hard. However, you have to provide a balance between things that often don't work well together. It's for that reason that I wanted to use this slide with the circles that you've got, because they don't necessarily always butt up against one another perfectly, but they do have areas of common interest. When we're looking at Europe, we're talking about very large numbers of citizens, and the economic values that we're talking about also are very large. This is something which obviously has to be taken into account when we're talking about fair, free public transport. The economic and financial balance here means that there are issues that have to be resolved at contractual level as well. What I mean here is that there's European rules, there's national rules, and often in certain countries, but particularly in Italy, these are not entirely updated or not entirely integrated. Now, with certain rules, often there's only a very few experts that know the letter of the law for each of the individual regulations. And this means it's very difficult for the businesses to update all of the contracts and for everything to eventually filter down to the individual users. It makes it quite hard in terms of the management that's going to be done. It means that businesses often say, look, this our internal rules don't include this. This has come from that piece of legislation, so that has to be included. And the burden of that and the lobbies, the pressure that's coming, says that there has to be standards in place in order to protect the interests of this particular economic group or section. So here we've got the two parties facing one another, the political side of things and the business side of things. And here we've got individuals that have seemingly different interests. And so you've got the financial and economic interests on the one hand, looking at costs, trying to ensure effective service, quality service, trying to ensure that the user is satisfied. But then on the other hand, you've got the more social profile and the more social aspects linked to social inclusion, territorial inclusion. Here, for example, of course, you've got that example of people living in the suburbs of major cities.
Dalle quartieri residenziali.
And so this is obviously something which is very important. We've got to get these people who are in the suburbs into the cities, into to work. So these are things that are all taken into account. These are the objectives, and this is where problems come up. There's issues relating to safety and various other factors. So now let me look at how all of this can work together. Obviously, you've got local public transport, and that service, like all other services of general interest, are not often dealt with at community level. Here what we're often looking at is basic principles of free competition and a market being out there, and that having to be taken into account as well. So what I've tried to show you here are the different values in the chain. So you've got liberalisation, privatisation, competitiveness in there as well. And what's very important here isn't necessarily that somewhere might prefer to have a private service over a public service. Instead, at community level, what we're talking about is laying down rules for the member states. Summary rules, saying essentially you are free to choose a network manager. That office would then manage that system entirely, and then indirectly that would be contracted out, if you like, or in-house providing, as we have classically. But we know the problems that often brings about in terms of maximising effectiveness and innovation as well, both in terms of quality and quantity and costs, of course. Or you turn to the market. And few know that the very first articles of a regulation Article 1 of the regulation says to guarantee the provision of services of general interest, they need to be more numerous, safer, of better quality, or offered at a lower price than what the market would be able to provide. So what the European standard here says is that you don't have to decide one system or another. Instead, we're looking at compensatory measures, and that here is included in Article 4 of the regulation. 4C specifically refers to compensatory measures. And there's the definitions and proportions of net costs included. But what it does do is seem to open the door to possible solutions for completely free public transport. So that isn't ruled out by the legislation at all. The kind of compensation that's mentioned here is linked to objectives in terms of maintaining social standards or achieving social standards within individual member states. And this isn't considered to be against the treaties. I mean, this is what I'm saying. This is what the regulation tells you in terms of compensation. And so the standards here do give quite a large remit for that. Now I'm really getting down to the core business of my speech today. Here I want to talk about the macro differences between organizational models. When it comes to organizational models, I've found two macro distinctions here that cover more or less everything that we've spoken about today. So looking at business effectiveness, the kind of macroeconomic competition side of things. And the social inclusion and issues on the other hand, looking at inclusion. Of course, at the moment, we're looking at mostly the market, looking at market inclusion. Now in Italy, it's possible to say, I think, probably that we have seen a failure of the kind of social inclusion side of things and those aspects. But the theories that look at this start with the idea of favouring public intervention only when it's absolutely required, and only for certain aspects, leaving a very broad margin for service managers to self-regulate. This can create issues. So there are levers here. Improvement in efficiency of the service. This often leads to issues with coverage of the service. You've got organizational models mostly based on business efficiency. If that does happen, then problems can occur in the network because it means you've got to cut off the dead branches, if you like. So there are certain areas which are less profitable or where the balance isn't right in terms of the number of passengers that you're getting on board. And in terms of the tariff, in terms of the cash flow, these simply aren't profitable, and it's difficult to maintain this because if you maintain that, you risk the network as a whole. So these theories, purely based on competition aspects, And in fact, this is something I'm going to be talking about later when we look at specific countries' systems. Often, these can work against the market themselves. It means they're essentially ineffective. They're not helping these companies to achieve their objectives. So we've got the mode of implementation. We've got problems in application, as I've just mentioned, where public intervention has to be very limited. The problems in application, that's something that we do see. The graph that I showed you at the very beginning with the mathematical model, which of course is incredibly complex, that shows them. All networks encounter problems, whether it be a small city or a very large city. There, we're focusing, of course, we have to look at demand, the requirements on the service in terms of the burden, just the number of passengers that there are. And of course, we're essentially in cities serving a centre in a kind of radial fashion. Where the network is providing services, in certain areas you may end up with duplications, and this causes problems. Apart from the issue of territorial inclusion, you've also got the aspect of social inclusion. So looking at all of the networks that are already existing. I mean, in Italy, we all know the situation is perhaps a little bit different, but I'll leave that there. However, often what we're talking about is specific users, students traveling at very specific times, or we've got commuters that obviously are going to, say, a commercial area or an industrial area or wherever it may be at a specific time. So you've got real pressure points. And if you're looking at this specifically from a business point of view, then you just have to meet at a compromise. You have to try and find a way to make the system very attractive, to ensure that it's used, but to ensure that you're also concluding this aspect of coverage, this aspect of social inclusion, ensuring that you are covering those areas where there aren't a huge number of passengers. Let's now move on to look at the models, or the organizational models, based more on, on this real problem that can exist between the social aspect on the one hand and the business effectiveness on the other. Social sustainability is, of course, incredibly important. A network working entirely on market powers is not going to be able to help everybody. It's not going to be able to move everybody around. If you work just according to market, just according to where the money is, then essentially you're going to end up cutting services that are less profitable. It will mean that for those citizens who live or work in areas that are better from a commercial point of view, those people will get a better service than people who don't live or work in those areas. So that theory seems to be very closely linked to the idea of sustainability. This is because, as regards ticketing, flows, the major objectives of territorial coverage, those aspects cannot simply be handed over to kind of business automation, if you like. Instead, they absolutely have to be in public hands. And this is where we really start to see the different side of things. We've got the choice of whether you have a more regulatory approach or a more business approach. And a choice has to be made. A choice of maybe having completely free public transport. So moving on, the limits of this theory, looking at social effectiveness and the social side of things, is this. Now this is a plan of a network from the other side of the pond. Now, I didn't want to bring up a European model here and embarrass anybody by pointing out their hometown, but in terms of distances and where we are today, I thought it would perhaps be a good idea to go across the pond and take the risk that nobody was from there. So the problem here with this theory is what I was saying at the beginning, that this theory is linked to a kind of mass coverage. We've got a network which is being maintained at all costs. So looking at the number of users, but keeping everything going on regardless, because that's what's considered to be important. Now, as with every extreme, this too probably isn't the right approach, just covering absolutely everywhere. And the problem here isn't in the organizational model being based on one thing or another. Instead, it's a problem, well, also a problem of regulation. So this here, this graph, shows you all of the regulatory cycles which follow on from one another, have followed on from one another in a kind of vicious circle in all of the member states. We've got regulations pushed or put upon people by the government, which has destroyed the market. That's the part in green. Then obviously there has to be intervention at government level, nationalisation, because the network doesn't work any longer, and so something has to be done. We've seen that in a lot of different countries. Everything falls apart, and so things have to be nationalised, because the market can't respond to the social inclusion aspect of things, as I've covered already. And then, as it always does, there comes to a stage where, in terms of the public finances, this can no longer happen. Therefore, you get full deregulation. That creates monopolies, large or small private monopolies. You have private operators, which, because they don't want to end up eating one another, then start to work together. And they're working within the same rules that created them in the first place. And so you can see, actually, you've come full circle. And so here you can see the merge of operators. It often creates services which don't work, which then comes back round again and leads us to regulation. Regulation being for social inclusion, as I mentioned before. And coverage, of course. So nationalisation, what I was saying before about services being duplicated. Because you want to have as many jobs as possible, as many people as happy as possible. And you kind of lose sight of the more economic aspects of things. With deregulation, exactly the opposite has, because everything is up for sale, essentially. So now let's move on to the levels of governance. Here you can see that if you take the approach of regulation, then instead of a bipartisan approach, you have kind of a tripartisan approach. Essentially here what we're doing is deciding the importance of the different aspects we were talking about before, the social aspects, the business aspects, environmental aspects. That's all decided at level 1 of the pyramid there, strategic. Then next level down you've got the tactical level. This seems incredibly important, but actually what you're looking at is implementing and practical action. So what happens in terms of tactical is real planning activities, infrastructure, looking at what can be done in a reasonable period of time. At this tactical stage, we're also probably looking at public activities. Not normally, however, carried out by politicians, carried out more by technicians. But yes, I can see the politicians are getting interested in this stage as well. So here really you're dealing with more technical issues. And then the operational level right at the bottom, this is leaving it up to the manager, whether they be public or private, to understand, to start to really organize the details of things in accordance with their priorities, of course, looking at frequencies, costs, ticketing, and so on and so forth. So here what we've got is the issue of attractiveness of public transport. And when it comes to attractiveness, what we've got here are the two different ideas that are opposed to one another. You've either got more of a demand-oriented approach or more of a supply-oriented approach. In Italy, in certain large urban areas, we've managed to reach a compromise on this too. And the organizational models where demand creates supply in the transport sector they're using a kind of a different way of doing things. And so there's a compromise and things seem to come together. So it's not really a problem of speed. Instead, what we're talking about here is what's this model?
Now, looking at the supply and demand model, which is at the basis of our optimum idea of what an urban centre should be and how it should function. This is one where the resources are considerable, but they don't link up all the destinations with all the possible points, but they do link up the main streams and do have interconnectability, whether it's by bicycle or train or what. Now, something which we've managed to do in Italy, but we're not necessarily going to export to Europe, is that we have looked at groups of small roads and used a lot of resources with double contracts, and we have actually doubled the number of starting points and the number of arrival points. So we have find out that doubling the options and using a lot of resources, we've actually, in some ways, doubled the problem. So, trying to balance things up between economic and social reasons does seem sometimes to be impossible. And this is the conclusion to my intervention. And I'd just like to add that we're talking about acting on a contractual basis. We're not talking about reforms. We're not talking about anything, because you've got standards already which give enough room for maneuver for the planners to act in a contractual manner. Next slide, please. And you'll see from this that depending how you look at the long and mid-term objectives, with the macro subdivisions between financial and social requirements, you get a overlap. So you see in the two columns that social requirements link up with economic long-term requirements and vice versa. And depending on the approach that you take, depending on the instrument you use to trigger this off, and depending on the indicators that you use to assess the efficiency and quality, when you see even more of a change. And all this, I think, is something that we find within the service contract, the regulated service contract. And that contract can actually provide for these three macro typologies. Practically all the risk of the service, looking at the objectives, the costs, the commercial risk, balancing out the different pricings. Right? If this is something borne by the public body, then it's impossible to forecast a cost, because it's variable depending on external factors which can't be prevented. So you can come up with two approaches. That is, the management takes on only the costs of the service, and the commercial risks are elsewhere. In such a case, there's no problem with full liberalization of the service, pricing, etc. And then you've got another approach in which there's no real risk, because under the contract the costs have already been assessed, so maximum use of the service, and under the current European regulation, we're talking about this type of contract. It doesn't necessarily apply to individual states, but you can opt for different types of contract. The first that you see there cannot really be used if we have total free public services. It would put burdens on the public finances, which you can't prevent and probably which can't be sustained. But the other two types of contract, depending on whether the whole burden is on management or whether it's 50-50, create certain problems for the company, and this is not necessarily going to provide incentive to the company, or you find that the company might wind down. Now, why? Because you've shifted not just the risk, But you're going to end up contractually with a system which is going to look at terms of costs vis-à-vis maximum use of the network. In the third hypothesis, you've got a fixed price, whether some form of transport moves empty or full, but there's always the cost of the staff. So at community level, certainly it's possible. You'll find it in 1370 of 2007, and there are specific areas where it's quite clear that compensation in these cases do take account of a reasonable use. The remuneration of capital, the normal remuneration of capital per sector, and the risk taken by the operator of the public service, etc. So this is a definition of reasonable use, which supposes a type of contract in which the public body then reconstitutes a maximum cost within which you have the operational use. And if that weren't the case, then it wouldn't work. So it's possible to plan this. Of course, it's a question of the taxes, etc. So I should just like to conclude with this image here, which to some extent comes back to the previous speaker's reference to the use of our land area. To transport the same number of people from one point to another, a collective form of transport has a capacity to take on board a certain number and uses a certain area of land, and you'll see that if you're looking at the use of land, there is a considerable difference. So I'll conclude on that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Allora sì, siamo un po' in ritardo con i tempi, quindi...
Yes, I should be using that hammer on you, I think. You've taken up so much time. Now I should just like to give the floor to Dr. Gudicina. Okay, well, I'm worried about getting hammered on the head if I speak for too long, so I shan't. Well, perhaps my view is slightly different, but I think it's important to focus on points on which we do agree. Points that we can use to move towards solutions. Looking towards reduction of costs. And of course this then harks back to the political aspect of everything. So, let's start on this. Well, I've been at university in Milan, China, and other parts of the world, and I think that, as you can see here, you can probably see it better than I from there, the fare revenues per kilometre depend on where you are, which urban environment you're in. It's not a question of individual companies, because, of course, you can have different prices and different companies, etc. You can see Milan, Rome, Barcelona. It costs €2.10, for example, for a single journey. But here you can see that the fare revenues per kilometre are not actually that high in Italy compared to other countries. So the next slide, please. Now let's have a look, on the other hand, at subsidies. And we see that Italy's subsidies are quite high on the average. So, in truth, in Italy, we have quite high subsidies per kilometre. And today, I think this is one of the political problems, that is that the price of our tickets don't cover very much of the cost of the service. We've heard about this, and perhaps this would be a point that we could use to say that we should move towards free fare, because people were saying before that only 33% of the costs of the ticket are covered in certain cases, and this certainly seems to be the case in Italy. So if we're looking at the billions of costs of the company, we're only of the order of a relatively small amount, 200, 250,000 via the ticket. No, you're not going to have to give me a political knock on the head. You're certainly not. No, let's have a look here of the fare revenues vis-à-vis the operational cost. In Italy, they're fairly low. I'll go quickly, don't worry. And another point which we have to bear in mind is elasticity. And I think I should point out that in Italy, the tickets cover relatively small amount of the full costs. It's not free because, of course, even if you don't pay tickets, if you have free tickets, somebody's got to pay for it. And in fact, who pays in the end is the taxpayer. So, in the UK, it's all shifted onto the cost of the ticket. But outside London, in the United Kingdom, you have companies, transport companies, which are much more efficient. And so, socially speaking, this is not covered by any public service subsidy. 100% of the cost is actually covered by the price that the traveller pays. So in the UK, people are highly sensitive to prices more than elsewhere, and seem to be quite happy with this because the ticket covers all the costs. So for €1.50 in some countries, in the UK, you probably have to pay something like €4.50. And in some countries, this wouldn't be sustainable. It wouldn't be acceptable for citizens. No. Elasticity of price. Certainly, there is a certain elasticity. If the price goes down of the ticket by 10%, then probably the traffic will go up. If you push it down to zero, then the number of travellers goes up. So there's a certain relationship here, and it happens vice versa. If you put the price up, then the number of people travelling will go down slightly. Metro and bus, of course, are different, and often the use of metro or the underground is different. People continue to use the metro even if the price comes up because they really don't have any alternative. So they continue to use it to go into the central part of town because they have to get there for a certain time, and it's a lot quicker. Next slide. Another point to take consideration of is technological innovation. When we're talking about the ticket price, we have to bear in mind the fact that you have the cost of a technological system, which is quite high. We're talking about 12% in Poland, I think, in certain cases. I know this quite well because I set up a study center on this in Milan with a colleague who went back to Rome and became Director General not long ago. And what we were looking at was a simplification of the system, moving from coins to another form of payment. And you can see that we've moved on to a more modern system under which, in Kuala Lumpur, for example, you put your credit card into the gate and then you get your ticket out. So the ticket card is, the credit card is your ticket. It's the same thing in London. You just put it on the gate and you get through. That's the ticket. But you have to actually look at the problem of who is going to manage the data, which is thereby created. So let's go on to the next slide. Now, check-in and check-out is a very important point because it's a question of efficiency here. We talked about that when you were referring to net cost and the contract. Now, we've seen, for example, in Rome that we're in the net here. And so all the costs go straight to the company, where in Milan, part of the money has to go back to the commune. So they've got more reason to wish to combat fare evasion. In Rome, it's a different system. So it's a short circuit, I think. And there's another topic which you have to bear in mind. Up until today in Italy, we have never actually moved to a transparent process to a company which costs less money. We need to be looking at the services, increase public transport. Now, how many of you have not got a car? This is a question I'm putting out to all of you. How many of you have not got a car? No car, 2 people. Okay. 4. 5. Okay, fabulous. Now, as you'll see, most people, some young people don't, of course, but there are those who use sustainable mobility, and also we're looking at future types of mobilities such as car sharing, carpooling, etc. Or bicycles, people travelling by bicycle. Mopeds. So you've also got these bikes that you can use, like the Santander bikes in London, that you can just pay for the bike and ride a certain distance and then clock it back into another bike slot again. So we're looking at efficiency and mobility in general. And another point I think you have to take a consideration of is when the tender comes through, that the costs are taken account of. Now, it's very different in different cities, and I've carried out a study. So if you carry out a tender for efficient transport, you come up with quite a high level. And then you see in Rome that you've got a system where they're moving on to free for public transport. So if the public subsidies were well used, then you could actually get hold of 200 million euros, which are not paid today. Another interesting issue here is a system which works quite well. The tenders in Italy are all rather obscure, in fact, but we do have Italian companies that put out tenders abroad. For example, in Copenhagen, driverless 24 hours a day. So considerable chains. You've got 2 metro lines. And having won the tender, having gone through the open tender process, they won it. And this has proved very, very useful in terms of competition. So you've got a public company, I don't want to go into the controversial aspects now, has gone abroad, has won a tender, has managed it well. And of course, the stakes are high. Well, we've looked at things like the quality. And if you carry out a survey, of course, you'll soon find out whether people think that the quality is adequate or not. So let's go to the next slide. This is just to point out that if you're looking at subsidies, it's there, but it's not huge. Rome is pretty high. It has a level of subsidies compared to Milan and other European cities, which is very high. It's almost free, if you like, in Rome today. But we've got problems, long-term problems in Rome. We've had terrible problems. There are 12,000 people working for ATAC in Rome, 9,000 in Milan, and for production per kilometre, and two companies which are the same size, of course, this is clearly a problem of efficiency. And above all, we're looking at the administration. So if you cut down on the number of drivers, for instance, that's one thing. But obviously, in this case, you've got a problem of efficiency. Let's go on to the next slide. These are the last points that I wanted to highlight, and then I want to get involved in the discussion, continue the discussion. I've been going very quickly, and I'll go even quicker now. These are the points which I think are interesting and important to discuss. I think it would be interesting to look at that. The first thing is that we need to make a clear distinction between free fare public transport, so completely free, like Tallinn, and what in fact can be a free fare at certain times of day or for certain passengers, as we said previously. So we have to make a clear distinction here, because the use, as Mr. Flosch said, is different. The free fare option can be a real management system, using mathematical methods so that you get the optimum use of public transport. So if you say that you've got free public transport from 5 till 7, what you're trying to do is improve the capacity of the means of transport. At certain times, instead of being all squashed together, you can travel more comfortably, and in that way you can optimize the use of public transport as well. So it's not completely free in that instance, it's just partly free. Think of London, for example. You've got peak time and off-peak time. It's similar, it's logical. Another point, let's not talk about slow transport, please, because one of the principal problems of operational costs is commercial speed. This is the principal element, because public transport has to be quick, reliable, and people take it to go into the city because it's quick and reliable, because they don't have to get snarled up in traffic. Otherwise, you can have buses that have bus lanes. And the more traffic that you have in the city, and the less public transport that you have, the more problems that you have, and the slower everything goes. Rome, Milan, Naples. Often you find that there's so much traffic that public means of transport get stuck in the traffic as well. So, looking at this choice, moving towards possible free fare, free public transport. Another point I think we should be looking at is pollution. There's the argument of pollution. I think that 10 years ago, well, perhaps some of you saw the car stands in Frankfurt last week. looked at the $20 million which has been spent on the hybrid electric cars. And of course, this is a question of pollution. And we also have to look at the polluting aspects of the car in other terms, in terms of the batteries, for instance. People are working on that. Looking at cars which don't produce pollution. And this is something which shouldn't be mixed up with the free fare argument. So don't mix up pollution and free fare. It's a completely different issue. Certainly, we've thought of measures to improve use of public transport, to improve traffic. And we've got the congestion charge, pollution charge, for example, in Italy between Amorate and Milan. And this, the gains from that have been, the profits from that have been to improve or to put into public transport. This is not something which came from a certain political party. So it's something which can be used and is used for a common objective. So, as we've heard, the objective of the UITP is to double public transport. So we need to fight this battle. And the last point, so I'll wind up on this, is that of intermodality, intermodal transport. The case of Chengdu is very interesting. All the metropolitan lines are intersecting. Through 2016, December, and the middle of January 2017, they constructed more kilometers of metro in China than in 50 years in Italy. It's incredible, 260,000 kilometers. It's very important to remember that you have to have intermodal transport. You've got rail, you've got bus transport, and then you've got the hubs, you've got the interconnections. We talked about the BTS, which was extended. And what I ended up with when I was using it is a friend that was waiting for me had practically to wait for me in the middle of the main road because there wasn't any proper way in which you could change from one mode of transport to another. Well, I hope I didn't say too much. I hope I've said everything I wanted to, and thank you very much indeed, everyone, for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giuricin.
Scusa. Do la parola a Paolo Vergnano.
I'll now pass the floor to Paolo Vergnano.
Grazie mille. Grazie dell'invito e grazie dell'organizzazione.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Daniela a lot for inviting me here today because this is a topic that we've been talking about between us since 2015, I think. 2015, no, you're right. Since Daniela's been an MEP, we've been talking about this and talking about ways to manage to introduce this specific argument here at the Parliament. I think this issue of use of public transport is incredibly important. As has already been said, it's important that we do get this to the European Parliament because it is the major European place for discussion. Here, what's discussed, what's talked about and decided has effects on individual countries as well as individual governments. So, in 2012, we had a study group in our region, which is Trentino. And in Trentino, we created a study looking at local public transport in our area. We're an autonomous region, so we have the opportunity to be able to decide to do what we want. We have that autonomy in terms of our public finances, so that's very helpful. And a group of people decided that we would run this study on public transport. At that time, the question sprung to my mind as to why we pay for tickets on public transport, and it seems like a bit of a simple question. But in fact, it's something which everybody in the study group was quite interested in. It's a question which any citizen might ask, and I was there as that kind of more market-facing person in the study group, so it was up to me to ask this question as a person who was by no means an expert in the area. So we looked at it in Trentino, then in Alto Adige, and we tried to involve other people and other regions. We went and met people. We also met people in Tallinn and had a conference with them and spoke to them about the whole idea. So this all started with the question, why do we pay for our tickets? And in part, I think we've probably already answered that question during our debate today. We've had a lot of different explanations for that. However, in my speech today, I wanted to start off with a very basic point that we've talked about a lot today, but we've got the International Agreement on Environmental Protection, and it is very important and at the fundament of everything that we do. So I wanted to speak to you about this section from the Transport Protocol of the Alpine Convention from 2002. And it doesn't just involve the Alps, it involves a lot of our territory. Essentially, a lot of our area is intra-alpine. And it very specifically talks about what the uses should be of our area and what the guidelines should be for public transport in our region. I've never heard any local government negate this or say that they don't agree with this. This is a very good convention. Everybody quotes it. But it does have quite an impact practically on what we do on the ground. And a lot of attention has been paid to this over the years. It came out in 2002, so it's not a new thing. It says, pursue a sustainable transport policy, or a more sustainable transport policy, which will reduce the negative effects of and risks posed by intra-alpine and transalpine transport to a level which is not harmful to people, flora and fauna and their environments and habitats. I think that all of us sat around the table here today know how the idea of all of us, who've dealt with mobility in mountainous regions will particularly appreciate the sentiment here, because we know how difficult it is to create infrastructure for the transport of goods specifically. And really here, what the policy is doing is trying to do away with the damage that's been done in the past. Often what we've seen is that railways that were included in the Alpine region particularly have been disappearing, and this is not right. The number of rail journeys that have become impossible have simply disappeared in Italy in recent years has been quite remarkable. For example, a famous bridge was destroyed in 2002, which provided good intermodal support for both road and rail. There has been financing, however, from the state, from the region, and from towns in Italy. And now we are slowly starting to reuse these railways. As citizens, it's important for us to ask whether these conventions have got an effect on our real daily lives in our regions, and whether they're taken into account when our representatives are making decisions. In Trentino, for a very long time, we've had interagency discussions about tunnels, about connections between the mountainous regions, and also looking at motorways and dual carriageways, looking at how many tunnels we need, how many vehicles use these roads on a daily basis. And so for the route through the mountains, we've been having some very in-depth discussions. Not a lot of progress has been made, but of course we have got areas which have got a significant amount of goods travelling through them, and so they are really very important. Yes, absolutely, they do produce a huge amount of money for the economy, but they also produce an enormous amount of pollution. In some areas, in fact, twice as much as would be accepted by the European Commission. So that brings me to the COP21. And here we can see the same kind of a conversation as was being had in the convention. This international agreement is, I mean, it's a wonderful thing to behold. It talks, of course, about the 1.5 degrees C increase above pre-industrial levels. In order to achieve this, we have to do something now. Action has to be taken straight away. Then it talks, of course, about promoting measures to protect the environment. And here, again, we've got new types of fuels that have to be taken into account, and we always are hearing about new kinds of fuels. However, if we're talking about not threatening the environment, then we're looking at climate and use of food crops. So, for example, the move from diesel to biodiesel, we have to think about whether that is right in the light of what's written in COP21. And I have to say, honestly, that's a question that I'm asking myself now. We've got refineries now that are working to create biodiesel, which comes from food crops. And I think that as a global population, in fact, one of the richest sections of the global population, we have got a certain responsibility. Point C says making financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. Now, when we hear people saying that public transport is a cost, or that fare-free public transport is a cost, it makes me wonder. I mean, often we're talking about the poorest people in the world. We live in a beautiful place and we're very rich as compared to the majority of the global population. So therefore, don't we have a responsibility in terms of how we use our financial resources to really bring about what it is that we've written in documents like these? So shouldn't it be up to us to make these efforts to try to see things a bit different, bearing in mind that we are some of the richest people on the planet? because it says this agreement will be implemented to reflect equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So we have to take that into account as well. We are some of the richest people. Different areas have different responsibilities, bearing in mind where they live and the amount of money and amount of resources that they have to them. But this is a huge responsibility and one that we have to bear. Now, in addition to this, we also have to look at health studies for looking at public health. We heard it said this morning, but cars, according to the WHO, are one of the main causes of public health disasters. By trade, I'm a pharmacist, and nowadays we're seeing allergies amongst the population increase enormously. We're seeing worse cases than we have done since the end of the Second World War. And we've seen a vast increase in the amount of private vehicles being driven around. We've got a lot of cases of respiratory diseases, allergies, asthma, heart disease, cancer, and obesity. And obesity obviously is something which is linked to vehicle use, car use. And it's not me that's saying that, it's the World Health Organization that's saying that. It's these kind of private transport modes which run from our house, from outside our houses or in our garages, right to the garage of the office, where we then go and sit in front of a desk the entire day. At a computer. It means that we're not putting in any physical effort to get to work or to carry out our daily lives at all, and that obviously is negative for our physical and psychological well-being. Now, yes, urban areas are being asked to provide a solution, and when we look at urban areas, noise is another problem. At the moment, I'm constantly dealing with issues relating to traffic and noises coming from cars. I think it was 30% of the time, 40% of the time perhaps, that we spend in open spaces. We have vehicles around us creating unnecessary noise levels. Now, this is because vehicles are used by everybody. And again, because policies thus far have pushed society in that direction. Now, the final line there, I left there on purpose. I didn't want to talk about car accidents specifically. I didn't want to talk about that. I've specifically written street murder. I've done that on purpose. Because that really is what it is, and we can't close our eyes to that. Now, yes, of course, you could. There are all sorts of reasons why you could have a car accident. You can not be able to brake suddenly enough, be too tired. I myself have sat in a car and driven hundreds of miles. But if I have an accident, it's because something happened with me. I made a mistake. It's not because it was an accident. It's not because somebody came down from above, something happened that was completely out of your control that made that happen. I'm sorry to have put the word murder up there, but a mistake occurred. Somebody made a mistake. Normally it's the driver, and this was the outcome of it. But this is because we drive down the road every day, taking with us 2 tons of steel, and obviously this is going to be very serious for a pedestrian or a cyclist. Even if it's a pedestrian, however, that's made a mistake, it doesn't alleviate or relieve the blame of the driver or result, because at the end of the day, we none of us have a license to kill. Now, nowadays, people have been talking about what a human life costs in terms of health, social losses, personal losses, losses to society. It's very, very complicated to come up with a number, to come up with a figure for what a human life is worth. But if an administration does manage, I think, to reduce murders on our roads by 10%, or by injuries caused on our roads, this wouldn't only have a social benefit, I think it would also have a financial benefit. Now, why is it that we're so convinced that cars are a beautiful thing? How long is it that we've thought this? I have to say I'm not as fascinated by them as other people. But there is no advertising agency that will tell you something different. They always want to show you a vehicle that is out there on the roads all by itself, not surrounded by any other cars. It's free. They never show it stuck behind a bus. They show it out there on the road by itself, running free. Have any of us ever had that kind of journey in our car? Now, for example, that at the top, that is Genoa in Italy. This is an area that we know quite well. There's a lot of flyovers and bridges and tunnels, and it's an absolute disaster, that place. It's quite scary. It's been privatized and nationalized as many times as you like. And I have to say, I quite like to see a couple of car ads with the car in the middle of a traffic jam. But they're simply not going to do that. It's not what they do. And so I think even the advertisers don't like what a car has become in our cities. Now, I remember on a Facebook page, I think there was a little joke, and it was just a joke. But somebody had arrived in Trento, a very big city. There's quite a few cars there. And they'd written, "Trento's beautiful, so lovely, but God, there's such a problem with all the cars in the historic centre." Because no tourists want to go to a beautiful historic centre and see lots of cars there. And we in Italy have got some of the most beautiful cities and towns in the world in terms of the architecture. But we let people use their cars wherever they like, completely indiscriminately. And yes, cars are a sign of growth and mobility and the economy. We don't want people to remain at home. We have to give them these options. But in the last 50 or 60 years, it seems that politicians have completely ignored mobility policy and essentially allowed the car industry and car drivers to do whatever they like. So what is it that's happening with cars at the moment? Well, I think we've all realised that at the moment we are working within a system that has negative effects, whether they be financial or social, and that we've now really reached a breaking point in terms of sustainability. We've already spoken about the health problems. I talked about environment, and the issue of the environment is, I think, incredibly concerning. It's important for us to look at how much it costs to tarmac an area in order to let however many vehicles get across this spot. You can work out how much cement it is, how much tarmac you need, how many man hours you need, and you can get to 100, 120, 150. You can find yourself a number. But what you've also done is destroyed an area. And what does that cost? What were we doing with that area before? Were we using it to grow food for us to eat? Well, then that takes us back to COP21. So are we moving in one direction or are we moving in another? And it's true that often there isn't an alternative in terms of public or private funding for providing an alternative for this. I've been fighting for 3 years at least to remove cars from the historic centre where I am. But it's not just because we've got cars out of a historic centre in one town, in one city, that we've managed to make a huge contribution. We have to bear in mind that large areas are being tarmacked over and we will never get them back. It's not just, if you put a road down, you can't say, oops, probably shouldn't have put that there, pull it up and go home. Nope. Instead, that road will be there for 100 years. I mean, for example, if we put a bus route in a town and it doesn't work, then the day after we can change the bus route and do it slightly differently. That's not a problem at all. But when we're spending social funds and social money, we should ensure that it's got a social objective at the end of the day. We have to look at how much money we have to spend to make up for all of the mistakes that we've made. We always have to provide a public transport. We need public transport. Not everybody is going to be able to afford a car. This contribution has to be made. And so at the end of the day, we're going to be subsidizing people who are using public transport. These people should be using public transport, but really what we should be doing is getting everybody on public transport.
Invece ci piacerebbe.
What, on the other hand, you'd like, I think, this is not a political or party battle, it's something else. Perhaps it would be better to move in a more sustainable manner. And we discovered that public transport creates work everywhere. The car doesn't, because we don't manufacture it everywhere. I'm not trying to fight a battle here, country versus city, not at all. Because we subsidise car manufacture as well. We subsidise cars. And so it's the general taxpayer who pays part of everything. However, this increases people's social skills. All the studies that we have seen on the increase of public transport, the increase in use of public transport, have shown us that it increases social contact between people. And it reduces the negative imprint of the car. It increases also, quite a lot, it increases property values. This is something which has been referred to already, but it's something wonderful for property owners and property developers. We're talking not just about large towns or small cities, but we're talking also about smaller towns of, say, 40,000 inhabitants, for example. So it's positive. It increases also business. And of course, there is this battle between businesses in the historic centres of cities and elsewhere. On the other hand, people are saying, okay, if you take people away from us, what's going to happen? Well, we have a great system, I think, where we can force large commercial concerns to ensure that they provide parking. But this doesn't solve any problems. What we feel is important for the well-being of the citizen and what is positive for the environment is to have the historic centres of town accessible, but also have the major commercial areas outside the town. So a person can go A to B to C to D, and they need to know they can do so, and they need to know that they can do without their car. And, of course, this provides a boost to the local economy if you've got sustainable mobility like that, and public transport as it is substantially. So, businesses, all those who they are dependent on, live in the region. So if you've got someone who manufactures rubber or something like that, it's not going to leave all the profits in the region, but the car driver actually consumes in the region where he or she is. In 2013, we worked with 14 associations and 5 unions, and we decided that we would propose a law to the provincial authorities. This is getting a bit political. It's interesting, though. So we suggested a law on sustainable mobility, and this is in Trento and linked up to the provincial authorities there. So we had the suggestion put forward, and then we had it drafted properly. And this was a law to develop sustainable mobility. We noticed that 74% of journeys were done by private cars. And then, on that basis, we wanted to move on to a change to sustainable mobility. And we found that as far as the workplace was concerned, about 90% of people involved used their private cars to go to the workplace. And only one person usually was travelling in each individual car. Now, the aim of the law was to create a shift in 10 years, to completely switch things around. We don't think that you can get rid of cars from our system at all, but we wanted to shift the figures and make it so that 50-60% of transport should be collective transport, and the rest would be car sharing, carpooling, bicycles on foot. Carpooling, and particularly car sharing, operates in the same areas as public transport does, in fact. And our difficulty is that people have got a car. It's useful for us to fund a car sharing company and people still got their private cars, individual cars. Because the one thing contradicts the other. It's not a problem to finance car sharing. But if you find that you've got both private individual cars and car sharing, which is being funded, then you're creating a contradiction in terms in a way. And we have the problem that we know that we can use one method or the other. We take our own cars and we don't need to do car sharing. We'll have a look at this afterwards anyway, a bit more, the why of the whole thing. Anyway, this is the reason why we reached a certain conclusion on this proposed law. The proposal was based on 3 or 4 elements. In 10 years, we wanted to move on to a very high percentage of sustainable mobility. And of course, we had to involve people in the choice of funding and infrastructure, because a public debate always leads to better solutions than a solution which is pre-decided and imposed from above. So if you discuss projects before you implement them, then the implementation has already got public backup. It's complex as well. It's complex for those who are proposing it, who are writing it, who are thinking it through. So we need to start off with a discussion in the region. What do you need? We need to ask people. And it seems pretty banal, doesn't it? But if you've got 2 communities, you have to ask people that, what do you need? Not, do you want a tunnel? Do you want a railway? Do you want a bridge? Do you want a road? Okay. One person might say, I want a road. Another would say, I want a railway. So I think you need to have a public discussion on the objectives and on the funding. We heard from Mr. Flausch. Representative of the company that actually provides public transport. And we, and this is something I participated in, we fear that if you take the ticket away, it's not that you're taking funding from the system, you're taking away the ticket. And people are going to say, no, don't do anything, please, because this is going to cause problems. So we were talking about refinancing public services. We're a province. And we have the luck of having a pretty healthy budget. So there can be quite substantial decisions taken on the use of local resources. So we can say, what do we spend our money on? We can spend a little bit more on transport. So we could double or triple the funding of public transport. And within this system, we can take away the ticket because it's a question of promotion. So for 100,000 euros, we have produced a much better benefit. But what is the basis, the economic basis of this? In Trentino, we spend about 100 in the end, million euros for public transport. Among this, we have the ticketing cost. When people ask me, what does a ticket cost? It's not free. You've got to print it out. You've got to distribute it. You've got to sell it. So about 4 or 5 million euros in our area is what that costs. So what we did is we carried out a couple of calculations. In Trentino, public transport is financed by the general taxpayer to the tune of about 93%. We've got about 5 billion budget, and difficult to invest 7 or 8 million euros a year to promote public transport. And when we went to committee for the first time, with everything very well written down, one of the commissars said, we're talking about a few million euros here for a few hundred meters, 6 million euros for a few kilometers of asphalt. But nobody has asked about that. Could we not perhaps not use that 6 million this year and see what happens if we invest in public transport? 10%. 10% according to Trentino, are the number of people who wouldn't use their cars anymore because of public transport. And if we can shift that number of people from car to public transport, then we would automatically save 15 million euros from the public budget. We're not talking about anything else that we've done. We're not talking about all the other issues involved, bronchitis, asthma, allergies, etc. We're just talking about road accidents now. Even if our colleagues from the health authority were to ask for money. Sorry, I'm taking too long, said the speaker. So, we said to Trento, just like Tallinn as well and others, at least 10% of people, in the worst case, will move from car to public transport when public transport is provided free. And most of them will be people who every day go to and fro to work. Commuters who risk arriving late if they don't manage to take the right routes. And then you've got the real boycotting carried out by the administration. I don't have any problem in saying that. The administration, the guys at the top, are often the problem. They go and say, go and have a look at that map there. Go and have a look at how we assess this area of our region at this particular juncture, etc. We found that a few years ago that from the Tremonte region that public transport was actually taken out of the system. It's difficult to understand, but this is a system that has to be decided upon in an autonomous way by the region. Not just the communes and the provinces, but all the different administrations of the region have to get involved. perhaps we could be asking whether we should be living in a group of nations which actually boycott certain types of technology which would enable us to make progress. Now, what are people frightened of? I think that the fear is that once we provide free public transport, then our citizens will get used to using it. And then the funding or the finances of a particular region will continually have to be used for public transport. But it doesn't seem to be a fear when we're talking about building a road or a railway. So what we are looking at is our system moving forward and moving in as sustainable a way as possible. Now the response of the Department of Public Works, when you put the question of sustainable mobility to them, and this is Trento, they say, yes, we accept the concept. It's great. The objectives are fabulous. Yeah, we can change things slowly. It's okay. They changed it slightly, but not too much. So there's certainly the question is there. They have accepted this concept. They're going to increase the amount of money. But within the law, what they said, what they wrote, is that they will provide funding, okay, for private vehicles. I haven't got a slide. But what I'll show you is a slide of a German study which shows you that the most pollution which is caused by a car is not so much the use of the car, but the making of the car. And during the use of the car, the fuel is a percentage of the pollution, not the full pollution. You've got oil, whether it's an electric car or an ordinary car, for example. So 30% of the pollution is what we're talking about. 55–60% of car pollution is manufacturing of the car and scrapping of the car. So only 40% is the fuel. Or rather 30% is the fuel. So when we're talking about changing the engine, perhaps we should just be looking at this issue of the private car in a slightly different way. Of course, you've got some fantastic developments, but when some of these models are applied to private vehicles, it's not necessarily the same thing. Perhaps in 20 years we shan't really have changed very much. Perhaps we'll have slightly less pollution. Perhaps our environment will be slightly cleaner. So whether we're talking about petrol, whether we're talking about electric, it's not as though as we're going from 100% to nothing. We have to look at the manufacture of the car, we have to look at the transport of the car. So I don't think the problem is exactly as we see it. What the problem is that we need to use the resources that we have better. And this brings me to the concept of citizens' space. Perhaps this is a highly simplified slide, I'm sorry to show you this in such a simplified way, but it does indicate how much consumption there is in terms of fuel and movement of cars, depending on the space. So we look at a car which can take 5 passengers, right up to an articulated bus which can take over 270,000 passengers. If we have a consumption of practically 200 litres of petrol to carry 5 people over a certain number of kilometres, then you can see what the data is. I don't think you have to be brilliant to see that the number of litres of fuel goes from 200 down to 26 in the largest vehicle. So if I think of my private car and moving around in it, it's not as though this just disappears when I get to my destination. I leave it there. And the 2,000 cars which transport 5 people take up 24,000 square meters of space. On the other hand, if you use the largest vehicle there, you only have 2,370 square meters used up. But there are 2 substantial errors, I think, that we're dealing with here. Firstly, you never have 5 people in a car. If you're lucky, you've got 1.5. So 24,000 square meters should be multiplied by at least 4. And then 200 litres of fuel. That should be multiplied by 4 as well. So 800. And the last line, however, you see the space. 2,370 meters. But I wonder, you've got the 37 vehicles there. Okay, how many times have you travelled back from work and you've travelled in your tram and its tram's been fully occupied? When you're talking about a few hundred square meters. So, you do have a savings there. You're saving urban space and you're helping preserve the environment. I think that all technology which brings us to such a result demonstrates how parking places are not useful for us. I don't think you even need to discuss it, it's obvious. Let's go to the next slide. Perhaps just a small overview of the general objections which are voiced to the ideas I've been airing. I looked at a lot on the internet, I talked to people about things, I looked at all sorts of different issues. But these are comments which we hear from a lot of people. There are a lot of people against all this. They refer to safety. They say that if you have public transport which is free, then people will start to destroy all the means of transport. But people who use public transport more are certainly going to be defending it. So that's wrong. Secondly, People say that their buses are going to be overloaded. Too many people. Everybody's going to want to use them. So there's going to be a problem that you're squashed into the buses like sardines. But quite honestly, that's pushing it a bit far. And the car industry, what's going to happen to the car industry? And then if you make a phone call to car manufacturers, he says, well, it's not true. Because if the car at the moment is produced to the tune of 20 man-hours, then if you want to manufacture a bus, it's going to take you nearly 1,000 man-hours. Because a bus takes a lot longer, it's a lot more complex. So in fact, what you might think of that this is automatically going to adversely affect the car industry is not true. So normally the same company which manufactures private vehicles also manufactures public vehicles. No, I got this from a French company. Fourth point. Okay, this is the same person, Not everybody's the same. Every system, every people, every city reacts differently to the idea of fair, free public transport. So that applies everywhere, doesn't it? But throughout the world, if you put up the word sales or discount, you're going to get a queue of people to come and buy it, aren't you? It doesn't matter whether you're in Europe or China. You just have to have a certain percentage, and then you put a red circle around it, minus 10% or whatever, and people are going to come to buy it. So it's not that people are that different. They actually react in exactly the same way. And then point number 5. They say we can't afford it. I'm not saying everybody, but for most communities it's not true that they can't afford it. We ourselves have noticed that most communities pay more than 90% of the cost of public transport via normal taxes. It's a small part, which is actually financed by the ticket. So the same people that get to this point say, no, well, it's not going to increase the number of users, is it? No. It's not true. Because they just said, in fact, that they would increase for the other objection. Objection number 2. So there's somebody actually involved in our region who is voicing these same 2 contradictory objections. And if ever you were to put it in practice, you would destroy the entire car industry, said this person. So either nobody's going to use it or everybody's going to use it. So I think that when we have this concept, it needs to be properly implemented. Then you've got the students, the unemployed, the homeless. They'll just use public transport for fun. Our experience that we have seen during the course of this year, where this has been implemented, has demonstrated that this is not true at all. It's exactly the opposite. And then public transport quality will go down if we don't invest. Well, that's going to be the case anyway, isn't it? If you don't invest in public transport, it's going to deteriorate. But this has nothing to do with it. Next one. Sorry. Next slide, please. So, the response that we have given, it's a little bit radical. Is that the ticket, which is used for public transport, is used to decrease the number of transport users and fundamentally to increase the need for the private car. This is the result we came up with. Why pay for a ticket which really, in the end, does not fund a system at all? And this is what really does apply in many sectors, in many areas. So the next one, please. Thank you. It's clear that public transport, free public transport, is a technique. It's not the solution to all our ills, not at all. But it is a system to make a system of transport attractive, a system of transport which has been demonized for almost a century. Since the birth of the major car industry, public transport has been demonized. If you look at the publicity during the fascist years in Italy, for example, on the use of the car, incredible, incredible. You see, buy a car, buy this, do this. And there was a guy there and he was pressing the horn. He was driving through the city and he was throwing things out right, left and centre. And that was publicity, that's advertising. And we've seen that in Italy, we see it in all cities. Okay, that wasn't acceptable, but we're not too far away from that even now. People have talked about the cost of the train and the cost of the car. I can't remember the figures, that the car only costs 15 euros, whatever. But the perception of people on the cost of the private car does not cover the full cost of the car. All it really covers is the cost of the fuel that they buy. But if you actually do calculate the cost of the journey, 3 euros for the petrol, okay. But you've done 30 kilometers with those 3 euros. And the car costs, in fact, a lot more than that. But who says that? Because the car is one of our major problems. We don't write down that this car is going to come to the end of its life, for example, and it will have cost you so much throughout the course of it. We don't say that it's going to cost you 60, 70, 80 cents a kilometre. Because if you were to say that, we can't, nobody would be able to afford it, or nobody would say that they'd be able to afford it. And in fact, is it going to be free for everybody? Probably not. There are certain municipalities that can't do it. I'm thinking particularly of the metropolitan system, the underground system. They have automatic tickets, but there are a lot of municipalities, of public authorities, that could actually go on to free transport. And then, and I really will finish here, this is a request I put to Daniel Auto. This is the last slide. So this is a question I'm putting to you. What could the European Parliament do in this instance? because I think that perhaps in concluding, it's a good idea to put a question to the organisers of this event and to see what they think that they could be doing as a parliament. So what could the European Parliament do? As far as I am concerned, they could put free public transport within the list of good practice to promote sustainable mobility. They could cut down on or cancel, I don't know how, but I think it's very important to trigger off some kind of policy to do so. So they could do something to cut down on the boycott of administrations, particularly administrations which are at the top. Because local administrations fear sometimes to implement this because of what might be imposed upon them from the top. They fear that somebody from the top is going to say, oops, that's too much, we're going to take money away from you. And then I think we could promote joint work, different groups, different administrations, different sectors, mobility, but also health and social sectors. Sustainable mobility is something which I think you could introduce to the health services, saying it's not going to take money away from you, far from it. Let's test it, let's check it out for a few years and see whether it works, so that we can have a management plan in the future under which we can work together. And then what's this problem of social refound? Because why am I introducing the concept of personal subsidy? How much does it cost to subsidise the unemployed, to subsidise students, to subsidise older people, so that they can use public transport but don't pay the full cost? Of course, you're promoting public transport which is really used to its capacity. I don't think it's a question of putting in more funds. If I go to a company and say we want to make sure that we have full capacity, then they'll probably say yeah. And then, of course, democracy. We need to promote democracy here, have local referenda, for example, and then go back to the administration and hope that they've read through this all properly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, even if it was a little long. This is the Italian panel. You've seen the difference in the organisation. Now, unfortunately, in the European Parliament, we don't have that option open to us. Often we've got just 1 minute or 2 minutes to talk. But I know that in Parliament in Rome, it's a little bit different. You've got 35 minutes to give your presentations. So that's why I was trying to get everybody to hurry. It wasn't because I'm mean or anything. We just have to do that. That's one of the major differences between us and Italy and everyone else in the rest of Europe. So we've not really got very much time left for a debate, but if anybody does have any questions, then they can put them to our speakers. At 6 o'clock, however, our interpreters have to leave us, so if anybody would like to ask a question that isn't in Italian, perhaps they should ask that first. Or if you've got any questions you'd like to put to our speakers for this morning, you can do that as well.
Vi ringrazio.
Okay, thank you very much. I work in a public transport sector, particularly working in the same area as Mr. Giudicin, and he'll perhaps appreciate a lot of the comments that I'm going to make. I
Di abitudine anche di rispetto.
I'd like to thank you very much for having this conference, and I appreciate you telling me to sit down so everyone can hear me better. I'd like to thank Daniela Auto for arranging this conference. It was really very well organized, I think, and it's dealing with a topic which is also incredibly important. I've just got 16 questions. That's it, don't worry. Only 16, I'll be very quick. Oh no, I'm joking, I promise. I've got a couple of questions. And I'll be brief, I promise. Just one question, I promise, just one. I participated in this conference to try to understand whether free public transport was a utopia or a realistic objective. And I think from all of the analyses and discussions that we've had this morning, I've seen that it is feasible. Free public transport is possible because those who are making this decision are justifying this with a very clear motive. Now, Tallinn has got a very clear motive, but, and I will try to keep this brief, could the speakers perhaps give me one thing that would motivate them, or that motivates those people that make this decision to provide free public transport, so that we can provide support to people in local government? I mean, I don't know if I've managed to make myself clear, but what I'm after here is, and I mean, maybe you could just give me one each, but I'm after motivations for free public transport. I'm sorry, I'm done. Maybe it was too quick, but I am finished.
Comincio io come
Maybe I can start us off. I think, legally speaking, any legally valid argument for it is a good idea. Talking about urban congestion or getting back urban land that is currently being used for parking. Trying to use this area because land use is something quite important. In Italy, specifically, we've got geological concerns in certain areas for preservation of the areas. I'm looking at this, of course, from a lawyer's point of view, and in my speech I said that legally there's absolutely no problem in intervening and doing this. When it comes to the compensation, there's no number that has been put on this. It depends very much on what's done from a management point of view. This has to, of course, go hand in hand with a policy which disincentivizes the use of contrasting options. Now, why did Tallinn work? Well, Tallinn worked because they activated these incentives. They incentivized people to use free public transport, but at the same time, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure, they removed an economic interest in using private vehicles in towns because the cost of the parking was so high that people weren't encouraged to use that. Or they reduced their amount of parking, or they increased the amount of areas that were pedestrianised. So these two measures have to go hand in hand. So you have to have an incentive on one hand and a disincentive on the other. In Italy, for example, we've got a lot of border regions, a lot of areas where we've got old customs zones, for example. And what we can do with those areas is change them, use them for intermodal exchange hubs. Use them for transporting tourists or for transporting individuals. And so nowadays, these kinds of areas can also be used for commercial vehicles for transporting goods. Of course, when you're talking about transporting goods, it is just one person. It's your classic lorry, and it takes up a lot of space on the road, and it can transport fewer goods than other options for that transport. So there were various different choices that have to be made. But I think whatever choice you make, it has to come hand in hand with policies which disincentivize the other options. Where I come from, there was a draft report to have free transport, at least for students. And there was €5 million a year provided for this. Now, this was an idea that was done. They thought they'd be able to pay for it with contributions from vehicles producing a lot of fossil fuel emissions, and that they would be able to contribute it there. So it has an incentive and a disincentive. So that would be what I would say. Reduce the public contribution that goes in, move that by incentivizing something different. So just having those two things go hand in hand.
La mia posizione che...
Well, you know my position, it's a little bit critical on this, but I think what you could perhaps say is, look, great, we're really good at making savings in public transport because we can be more efficient. Fine, well then we can decide how we're going to use this money. There's no kind of binding obligation here. You can look at the case in the UK, or you can look at the case in Tallinn. Both of these are public decisions that have been made to either have 100% coverage or 0% coverage. It's a clear decision, but I think what's important is this move towards efficiency. It's easy to justify this to citizens or to taxpayers by saying, okay, I'm going to cover this, but there's an increase in efficiency. You have to be able to justify it to citizens. Well, I wanted to highlight vehicles, public transport compared to private vehicles. The 10 hectares that were used to move the number of people 1 kilometre that my colleague was talking about, that is space that you're taking away from citizens, that you're taking away from society. It's a damage that's being done to society. That 10 square metres that you've got, we're wasting that 10 square kilometres, excuse me, for parking, on parking. It's a direct waste. So maybe we could say something like, you can't buy a car unless you can prove that you've got private space to park it in. But this kind of thing is a question of general ethics that's related to mobility. Leaving a car parked in a street is something which doesn't work particularly well. It produces an obstacle. It creates congestion. And I think there are some quite important motivations to take into account here. Free public transport here isn't just a utopia. It's a real tool that can be used. And I think in this period of transition, and I really think that's what we're in, I think we're in a transition period at the moment, we have to start looking at the future. We have to understand that we can no longer carry on with this crazy system of having all of these cars on our road. And for me, that's the justification. So, as everybody said, I think there isn't just one answer to this question. It's difficult to give you just one answer. The question that we started with was, why should we pay for a ticket? That was the question we started with. Now, we go out for a drink in the middle of the afternoon, and I ask you to get the cake because I can't do it. And you bring me a cake, a beautiful cake, a wonderful cake. We cut it up, we put it on a plate. I take that plate off you, give it to you, and ask you €1 for it. And then you tell me that you were the one that bought the cake. You were the one that paid for the cake. So why should you have to pay for the cake again? And I say, well, fine, if you don't want to pay it, I'll put it in the bin. And maybe I'm wrong, but I get the feeling that public transport is nothing more than just it's trade, it's rental or sale of a part of that bus or a seat on that underground train to fill it with a person. Now I'm the pharmacist. I come from a commercial background. This is essentially a shop. That shop has that a good in that shop would have a lifespan. It would have 3 months or 5 years. And I've got a certain amount of time, a lifetime, in which to sell that product. Once I've bought my seat, once I've bought the bus, and regardless of how many people are on it, it's still going to go down the road. It's not going to not go anymore. And I think it's the same as this idea of throwing the piece of cake away just because you can't get €1 for it anymore. If you put 4 or 5 people in the bus today that are 10 tomorrow and 30 on Friday, and you get 10, 20 or 30 vehicles off the road, then for me that's a very good investment. An investment that you don't need €30 for. Thanks.
Facciamo un'altra domanda.
We'll have another question. We've only got 10 minutes though. A quick one, please.
Allora, io
Thank you. I think that today has been very useful for me. Most of us who've participated, I think, do come from Italy, but it has been really very helpful. But I was talking with colleagues before, and I think that on this point we are perhaps demonizing the history of Europe and our countries, and in fact the whole world on this point. And that is the car industry. I mean, I'll give you an example. In Italy, Fiat employs feeds 40, 50,000 families. And even with the state aid it's received over all of the years, it has nonetheless contributed to Italy's development. And the reason I'm saying this is because I think we have to move carefully here. We can't say that overnight, without any real idea of what might happen, getting rid of private transport so quickly, I think is a bit rash when we don't know what the consequences of it might be. Particularly in the south. I mean, I come from the south. I come from Molise in Italy. And if I were to go to my town and say to 10 friends, tomorrow you're not going to be able to use your car because I say so, I think life would become a little bit difficult. And that's because all Italians, more or less, are used to driving the few kilometers it costs to go to the pharmacy or to buy some cigarettes. If we do decide to do this kind of thing, then we need to have a quick solution, easy solution that's provided. Otherwise, we really need to know what the future is going to bring, and we need to have a certain idea of what that future will be. Because yes, of course, we do use a lot of cars, we spend a lot of money. But you're right that if we realise that we spend €5,000 a year on our cars, we perhaps wouldn't use it, but we use them. Now, of course, I'm talking from an Italian point of view here. I understand that Italy is different to Brussels, say, for example, but in Italy, looking at this future of fare-free public transport, I mean, here, of course, we're talking about Rome always. How can we have this kind of experiment, even if it's just 6 months, even if it's just a year? How can we have this kind of experiment without spending billions of euros to update our public transport system? We're talking about having to get new buses, more eco-friendly transport, get this out everywhere, make all of the changes that are needed. Probably once we've made these upgrades, we're going to be capable of actually speaking about fare-free public transport everywhere. But I don't think that this is going to bring about the great social change that's been suggested. I mean, often we're talking about very small towns that have carried out these experiments. They're moving 100 people a day on a bus. If we talk about New York, Sydney, Paris, why should those cities do it? That's the question that I had this morning, and I don't feel that this afternoon's really answered that, because I think that other than thinking of this utopia, of this lovely idea, oh, wouldn't that be nice? I think we have to think about this a little bit more practically, and we have to think about the money. And nowadays, in Italy, and probably in the majority of other countries as well, the money simply isn't available for this, because those big buses that transport hundreds of people cost huge amounts. Have we got the money to go and buy those? Have we got the money in Milan, for example, to say, well, let's have 20 of those buses, that'll be nice? I mean, I'll leave it there, but I think honestly that this idea and this experiment will move forward in some places, but when we're talking about providing practical solutions, with the money that realistically local governments have got available to them, it's very difficult. I mean, which of us would go into a local government and say, well, I think this is a great idea, we should make this free, look, we should spend our money on this? Who's going to go and do that? Belts are being tightened. I'd like to thank you very much, however, for what we've talked about today. It's something that people have been thinking about for a very long time, but haven't had the courage to go out and talk about. I mean, of course, there are health issues that we absolutely have to think about that are connected to this, and that's an important factor. In any case, I will finish up. I think it would be very nice to understand exactly physically how this could be done on the ground. Thank you.
Allora, chiedo scusa se ritorno.
I'm sorry, I've not got another question, but I just wanted to respond to something that's just been said. We are lucky enough to have been able to hear from a lot of speakers today. But we also heard from Mr. Juricin. He did a study on Rome, and I've got it in PDF, and it's available online as far as I understand, where it does look at different realities, different situations, and the merit of the public-private balance here. It speaks about how Romans in Rome can move around for free in the city and still reduce taxes, and that's really a very, very interesting document. The question isn't one of resources. I think it's one of efficiency, because if you improve efficiency, then the resources are there. If Italy as a nation, however, continues to be as inefficient as it is thus far, and I'm sorry to continue to talk about Italy when there's people from other countries here, but if we continue to be that inefficient, we're not going to get ourselves anywhere. So new buses, hubs, these will come, but we're very inefficient at the moment, and staff costs are disproportionate in Italy. At lunch we were talking about this and saying that we've got public transport companies in Italy which are not horizontal organizations. They've got huge numbers of staff, and they're not progressing, they're not making any progress at all. The largest proportion of staff is taken up by drivers. If we can't improve efficiency, then at the end of the day, we're not going to get ourselves anywhere. And I'm sorry that I keep talking about Italy and keep talking about Rome, but we're not going to be able to resolve the problems if we can't improve efficiency. We're not going to be able to resolve this problem unless we tackle the problems that have caused it. And that is the reality. That's the reality that we need to be talking about openly everywhere, because it is a political decision that needs to be made. But because we constantly have elections, no politician is willing to stand up and say it. That is the one constant truth that we're facing.
Completamente d'accordo, non perché mi...
I fully agree, not because you quoted me, of course not, but there's something which you can easily download from a very, very liberal institute. So this is the one that I always turn to when I want my publications to be published. But I think what's important is not to be published, but to be able to say what you want. I think what is important is this differentiation between small, medium-sized and large cities, Chinese cities. If we're talking about a settlement of 4,000 people, that's completely different from others. Uber, for example, is a company that you have that carries out car sharing. Uber pooling, they call it. And they certainly use this system via an algorithm which makes them totally competitive with public transport. So that's something quite different, and something which may work in large cities and also in the countryside. But what we've seen is that they're being blocked at the moment in order to defend certain lobbies that we've been hearing from. But you have to look at this in terms of size versus individual citizens. Let's take Pescara, for example. You can't compare Chengdu with Pescara or with another little city. So you've got to look at the scale of this. So I think that when we're looking at such a system, we do have to be careful that we don't just copy a model, because there isn't really one individual model across the board. I think that we have to realize that we want to make savings, and We want to make political savings as well. We want to improve efficiency, and free transport might do that. It's a political choice. It's a political choice. We know where the choice is taken. It's taken by the politicians. It's something different.
Quando noi avevamo fatto
When we carried out the study on Trentino, the people in the trade who talked with us recalculated the budget, looking at the costs of staff, and they came up with 8,000 euros, which is exactly the cost of the ticketing which is carried out on a daily basis today. So it's not a Neapolitan problem or a Pescara problem. It's a problem for all of us. In Trentino, we have lots and lots of people in administration who are responsible for a funicular railway which just has 2 pods, which carries very, very few people up and down every day. But they need seemingly at least 15 people to manipulate, to operate it. It costs $500,000 if it works. Okay. But you've got 3 people who are managing this. You've got a lot of staff as well who are operating it. I love the public transport system. I'd love to have a good public transport system. I'm advocating it all the time. But it's got to be one that operates properly. Service is the key word here. Certainly. Restructuring is necessary at all levels, not just in Italy, but also elsewhere in the world. And you quite often have countries where public transport is in private hands. So perhaps you're only going to have in those instances one manager and a few people under the manager who are well paid, perhaps. Because if you've got somebody who's carrying this out as a private business, it can be different to when it is literally public transport. If we're looking at election campaign, I've done that. I've been in the middle of an election campaign. When we're talking about a union as well, and I'm saying no. I don't want to decrease the numbers of staff. I want to increase the numbers of staff, but in a different way. Oh, and then the person who wins says, don't worry about it, but. And then we create a system which is not attack. Certainly there is a political element involved here, of course. What do the bosses want to do? They don't want to pay 12 times the system of transport, of course not. But we have to say to them, we have to tell them.
Io volevo chiedo scusa.
No, allora.
Scusa, io volevo soltanto.
I'll be really quick. I just want to say thank you. I've been listening to this very carefully. It's been really helpful for me to listen to all your ideas. And I think that all that we're looking at here, of course, is something that we're working towards. But when we, in Campania, managed after the elections to send back all these things which had been on board, the splendid idea that the car also pollutes the company was my idea. And mobility has to be human. And I go to serve on the council by bicycle, for example. But I think that what we're seeing is a change, but it's very slow. And when we have proper policies, when people are committed to certain things, we have to realize that when there's an election campaign, there's a lot of support from companies. And all this makes it very complicated, the lobbying, the support. But I do think that what we've heard here are some very good proposals. Thank you. Okay. Well, we've said a lot. And I hope that when we all go home, we shall rethink what we've said, what we've heard. There'll be some changes, and there won't be others. It's been a wonderful meeting. I think it's been very useful. So let me thank you once again for coming here. Thank you to all participants. And thanks also, says the chair, to the interpreters who have taken part in what was really a marathon. So thank